Hi everyone, and welcome to Moonstone Makes. Today I have another book video for you. So in the month of November, I participated in the Bloomin Readathon hosted by Allison Pages and Cursed Reads, where there was this epic bingo board where every space is a theme of book and you read as many books as you can in November and you try to get a bingo. I tried to fill up the entire board by assigning more than one space to each book I read. I ended up reading 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 books in November for the readathon, so I'm pretty excited and I would like to tell you about them. But before I do get into it, I just want to say thank you so much to my patrons over on Patreon. You keep videos coming, book videos, knitting videos, hopefully someday more roller skating videos, and it's because of you that I'm able to do this. So thank you so much. If you're interested, you can check out the link down below. I have started doing digital downloads, which are really fun, and I quite enjoy them. Okay, that's that. Thank you. On to the first book. So, the first book that I read for the Bloomin Readathon was Stephen Fry's Mythos. I read this for the Moon Square, which is a book that takes place outside of the country that you live in, and the Earth Square, which is a book that either is published before or takes place before 1990. And this is a book that is a telling of Greek mythology, so that took place before 1990. I really enjoyed this book a lot. Stephen Fry's voice is just so wonderful. I read the physical book, but at the same time, intermittently, I also listened to the audiobook, which is really great because Stephen Fry reads it. And Stephen Fry, if you don't know, is one of England's national treasures. He's wonderful. He was Jeeves from Jeeves and Wooster. Jeeves and Wooster? Which is the first place I knew him from, and he's wonderful. He's great. He's an actor, he's a writer, he's a comedian, he's brilliant. And he reads the book brilliantly. His voice telling the stories of Greek mythology, starting from the primordial gods through the Titans, through the Olympic gods, and through to man and like lesser gods, is just so good, and I really enjoyed it. It's nothing groundbreaking. It's not a retelling like you might find in a Madeline Miller book or something. It's just him telling you the whole breakdown of all of these gods and their stories in a chronological order. And I loved it. It's exactly what I wanted in this kind of book. I wasn't looking for anything different than the stories themselves. I was really just looking for kind of an engaging layout of all of the Greek mythology stories. And that's what I got. And his voice is just wonderful and fun to read. While I didn't completely absorb everything in this book, it was still really fun to read. There's a lot of information in here, a lot of stories, a lot of different characters, and of course there are a lot of stories and characters that I'd heard before, but there were some new ones too. And I didn't take in all of the stories. I don't still remember all of the stories, but it was still really fun and really entertaining, and I enjoyed it so, so much. Okay, the next book I read for the Dandelion Square and the Water Square. Dandelion is a book that's been on your shelf for a really long time that you just can't seem to get rid of. And Water is to read a book from an author that you're thirsty for more of. And for that, I read Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which is 800 pages. I didn't love it. I liked it. It was fine. Okay, so Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell is, it's a fantasy. It's about English magic, and it takes place in the 1800s. England at that time had a very rich history of magic, but for hundreds of years, magic hadn't been practiced anymore, and it had only been an academic kind of historical thing that people studied. People used to do magic. But there are two men in England in the 1800s, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. It's Mr. Norrell, not Mr. Norrell, Mr. Norrell. And they're trying to bring magic, practical magic, back to England. I wanted to read more of this author, who is Susanna Clarke, because she wrote Piranesi, which is one of my favorite books that I've read this year. Piranesi is a fantasy novel, but it is slight and it is concise and it is just about freaking perfect. This book is kind of the opposite of that. This book is just so long and meandering, and it's dry. It's really good, but it's really boring. It's magic, and it's politics, and it's Victorian era style writing, and Yeah, it was fine. I don't know. It was fine, but I'm glad I got it read because it's been sitting on my shelf for so long and it's been staring at me, and I'm glad I did it. I had high hopes for it, but yeah, it just didn't do it for me. Like I said, it's good. It's a really good book. It's a really well written, kind of brilliant book, but it just like wasn't my avenue of thing. Anyway, I'm happy I read it. So the next book that I read For the Snail and the Lily Spaces. Snail is a slow burn. Lily is a book that deals with death or grief. This was The Passenger by Cormac McCarthy. I didn't really plan on reading this book for this readathon. Something I didn't mention before was one of the things that I wanted to do with this readathon was to read from my shelf, to not read any new books, not buy any new books, but just try to tackle all of the books that I have already that I haven't yet read. And mostly I did that. This is the one exception because this is Cormac McCarthy's brand new book. I started reading it the day it was released. I've read almost all of Cormac McCarthy's books. He was one of kind of my OG favorite authors. Not quite anymore. Definitely my tastes have shifted, but I have historically loved Cormac McCarthy. So I wanted to read this new book of his right when it came out. And it's a two-parter. So like he released that book, and then the second book in the duo is going to be released this month in December. So that book, while it was good, it was in some ways very Cormac McCarthy, in some ways very weird and not Cormac McCarthy. It's very unfinished. It's not even like the first book of a series where it feels like a satisfactory completion of a thing when you finished reading it. Like it felt completely unfinished. So I don't even know what to say about it because I still need to read the second book and it hasn't been released yet. But that being said, it's about a man who is a salvage diver. The book opens with him doing a salvage dive in a very weird situation. It follows him through a couple of different salvage dives where he dives underwater and goes and either gets to the wreckage of a ship or a plane or something that sunk that needs to be dealt with. The salvage diver's name is Bobby. He lives in New Orleans, so you're also following his life, his conversations with his friends in New Orleans. I think it takes place in the 80s, maybe the 90s, maybe the 70s. I don't know, a while ago. So you're getting glimpses of like this old New Orleans neighborhood and the people that he knows. You're also getting glimpses into his past, his relationship with his sister, with his grandmother. You're getting vague glimpses of his relationship with his father, who you slowly learn was a physicist. Bobby was a physicist before he stopped being a physicist and became a salvage diver. It's all very weird. There's a lot to it. There's a lot of different avenues. There's a lot of different pieces. There's a lot of jargon in this book. There's Bobby having a lot of conversations with different people about different things. So you're having these conversations with these characters about the depths and the mechanics of salvage diving. You're having another conversation with Bobby and someone else about racing, like car racing and like cars, and it gets all in detail about that. You're having other conversations with Bobby and other people about physics that just like all of this stuff was just like rah, 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 and completely went over my head. This book is seriously all over the place. It's very Cormac McCarthy in some of the style, some of the dialogue, the way people speak, the way people act. You're getting the short sentences, you're getting the kind of snappiness, you're getting the very strong atmospheric writing of Cormac McCarthy, but also it's just like really weird and all over the place. I have a feeling there's a lot of like metaphysical stuff happening in this book, but also a lot of like down to earth, fringy New Orleans lifestyle kind of stuff, like with drugs and drunks, and there's just all kinds of stuff in this book. I don't really know what to make of it yet. I have to read the second one. I enjoyed it, but it was definitely a little confusing, which is fine. I'm not like against confusing. I just kind of read it and rolled with it and just let sink in what was going to sink in, knowing that I'm just going to have to wait till the end to really be like, okay. So anyway, that was The Passenger. Yeah, that was The Passenger. Next was a graphic novel, The Magic Fish. And I read this for The Green Carnation Space, which is a book with LGBTQ plus themes, and for The Cacti Space, which is a non-meaty book, which means something short or easy to read. This was a graphic novel, and it was wonderful. It's by Trung Le Nguyen, and it's about this schoolboy Tien and his friends and his family, how he's discovering himself, how he's going to come out as gay to his mother, and it's all about the juxtaposition between real life and stories and storytelling, and how moving storytelling can be, how actually impactful it can be on real life situations. And it flashes between stories that get told between Tien and his mother, and then the real life happenings of Tien, his mother, their relationship, his mother's relationship with her mother. It deals with themes of queerness, of immigration, of family, and of friendship, and it's so good. It was so good and so cute and so moving, and it's short and it's easy to read, and it's really beautiful. The artwork is just so good. The color palette is so good, and I definitely recommend this one. It's a wonderful, short, easy, beautiful book. Next, I read The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. This is a new translation by Susan Bernofsky, and it's a beautiful cover. This is a reread for me, so I read it for The Root Space, which is a reread. I also read it for The Spider Space, which is a book with dark themes. So this was a very favorite of mine when I was in my late teens and I was just really starting to get really into literature. I loved Kafka. Franz Kafka was one of my earliest loves of literature, and this was the first thing I read by him, and I adored it. I loved the weirdness of it, the just frankness of this weird, bizarre, unrealistic thing happening in a real life situation, and I loved it. And I loved it in this rereading. So this is a book about Gregor Samsa. Gregor Samsa. He is a salesman. He is a young man who is a very hard worker. He spent time doing service for his country. He was a student, and now he is a salesman trying to make as much money as he can to make sure that his family is taken care of. He lives with his mother and his father and his sister, and he takes care of everything for them. He is working for them. He loves his family, and he's a hard worker, and he's done everything he's supposed to do as a young man. One morning he wakes up and he's a bug. It's a debatable thing. It's not a bug. Let's see, how does the new translation put it? A monstrous insect. So he wakes up one morning and he's a monstrous insect, and there's no explanation. And it's just about what happens in the aftermath, and it's a beautifully written, weird, dark story. It describes him just discovering his new insectiness and what happens when his family finds out and how they deal with it. And I love it. It's super short. It's like 100 and something pages long. It's a novella. It's like 100 pages long. And it's so good. If you've never read Kafka, I mean, I think you should probably read it. It's wonderful. It's such a surreal, weird little tale, and it's so powerful. I just love this book so much. There's so much about like love and devotion and rejection and the imbalance of relationships or something. What was so striking to me, I think, when I read this as a teenager and when I read it again now, was so Gregor wakes up one morning and he's an insect. And he's just like, what? I'm an insect. Okay. What am I going to do about work? If I don't show up to work today, my boss is going to be so mad. How am I going to deal with this? Do I send a letter? What do I do? And that's his very first thought, is the horror of not showing up to work. And I don't know if you've ever been in that space, but like the whole nightmare of like not showing up to work one day and like your coworkers and your boss being like, where is she? What happened? I can't get a hold of her. It's like, I don't know, it's this weird nightmare situation to me, and it opens with that, and it's just so good. Yeah, it's The Metamorphosis. It's a classic, and it's wonderful. Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time. I read it. This is a dense book, and so I thought it deserved 4 spaces. So I read it for the B space, which is a book with a lot of buzz. It's classic. I read it for the Lotus space, which is a book that features a disability. I read it for the Tree space, which is nonfiction, and the Ivy space, which was a highly rated book. So Stephen Hawking is a very famous physicist, and he wrote this book in the 80s, I think? And it's a brief history of time. It's supposed to be a brief account of the concepts of physics and an historical account of kind of how we got to our current thinking about the way the world works from a physics perspective. And I want to say that Stephen Hawking wrote this book with the common mind in mind, so that everybody could understand physics. And you know what, Stephen Hawking, you're just too smart for everybody, because so much of this, I took science in college. I was a botany major. I took science, I took chemistry, I took physics. And so much of this book was just like, blah, 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 blah. It went in one ear, it went out the other. It's not written like a pop science book for like the people who aren't into science so that they can understand it, you know what I mean? It's just written at like a basic college physics kind of level. So it's still not like most of this book went way over my head. I still do not have any understanding. I don't have much more of an understanding of certain concepts in physics than I had before I went into this book. But I did read the whole freaking thing, and I'm happy I did. I feel smart because I read it. It made me feel stupid and smart at the same time. But yeah, even though things went in one ear and out the other, and they didn't like stick in there that much, I'm still glad they passed through my brain, because I don't know, I feel like I'm kind of cool because I read this book. So I did see that he wrote another book called A Briefer History of Time, which I think is a more dumbed down version of this book. In my imagination, he wrote this book, and he's like, this is going to be for everybody to understand physics. It's for the common person. And then he published it, and everybody read it and was like, what the fuck? Like, I don't get it. And so he was like, okay, I have to dumb it down even more for you people. Here's another book. I haven't read that one. I'm probably not going to. But I read it. And I feel pretty cool because I've read Stephen Hawking. Yeah. This is Johnny, Would You Love Me If My Dick Were Bigger by Brontes Purnell. And this is a book that I read for the Variegated Space, which is a rare book or something with fewer reviews. Green Carnation, another LGBTQ plus book, and Succulent, which is supposed to be a book that makes you hot. And it could be in a sexy or an angry way. Now, I didn't read any like sexy books, like with that kind of like spice factor, or any books that made me angry. But this book did have a lot of sex in it, like a lot of sex in it. So I counted it. It's kind of like a cult classic, and it's a book about being gay in San Francisco in the 90s or something. Yeah. Brontes Purnell is a writer and a musician. He's also in a punk band, which I started listening to a little bit after reading this book. This is a pretty raw book. Like, this book is written in a series of vignettes. It's all like short little pieces throughout the whole book. And it's nonfiction. It's kind of memoirish, but not really. It's more, it feels, he's also a zine publisher, like he puts out zines. And this book feels like a whole bunch of zine articles put together. He wrote all of them, and it's, like I said, it's all about queerness, being black in San Francisco in a certain time period. It's about AIDS and drug use and relationships and just what it's like to be in his mind in a very unfiltered way. And it was really fun to read. It's written in a very casual style. There is something inherently punk rock about the book itself and about the writings themselves. And I had a great time reading it. It's gross at times. It's funny at times. It's very raw. Yeah. Johnny, Would You Love Me If My Dick Were Bigger? It was great. So that book was sent to me by Cypher Press because for the year of 2022, I got a subscription to their book releases for the year of 2022. Cypher Press is an independent publisher in the UK who focuses on queer literature. So that was one of the books that I was sent by them this last year. And the next book that I read was another Cypher Press book, and this is called Limbic by Peter Scapello. And it's a book of poetry. This is a very short collection of queer poetry. It was very good. Again, very raw and unfiltered. There's a lot of pain, but also a lot of love in this book, and I really, really enjoyed it. I definitely recommend it if you're into poetry, if you want to look more into queer poetry. He's a great author, and I really, really enjoyed it. And it's a very quick read, but very powerful and impactful. And for this one, I gave myself all the same spaces as the previous book, but I also added Tulip, which is a book featuring love, or a book that you predict you will love. And you know what? Just like there wasn't a lot of spice in the books that I read this month, there also wasn't a lot of love. I didn't read any love stories, but there was love in this book, so I counted it for Tulip. Okay, we're almost done. The next book that I read was Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. This is a Nobel Prize winning book. Got the Nobel Prize in Literature in, I don't know, some year, whenever it was published or something. And this book got The Cloud Space, which is a book that you think will make you emotional. The Propagation Space, which is a book that had an adaptation. There is a movie to this that I have not seen. Daffodil, which is a book about friendship. And The Ladybug Space, which is a book with a cute cover that may destroy you. So I loved this book. This might be my favorite / the best book that I read this month. It's a Nobel Prize winning book. Lots of people like this book. This is a very highly rated book. This might actually be the most highly rated book that I have on my shelves in general. It's really good. I do really like this author. This is the second book of his that I've read, and it's like right up my alley. So Never Let Me Go takes place in a dystopian past. It takes place in the 1990s in England. And we're introduced to a character who is a carer, and she is telling her story. And she pretty much tells her story from her earliest memories in a boarding school, all the way up through boarding school, becoming an adult, and then becoming what she is now, which is a carer. This is really honestly a book that I think is best read without really knowing anything going into it, so I'm not going to give you too much information about it. But what I will say is that it takes place in a world very similar to our own. There's this one dystopian element that you're only very slowly introduced to throughout the book. It's mysterious until it gets revealed what the thing is, and you're following the main character through her youth. The main character is Kathy, and two of her closest friends, Tommy and Ruth. You follow these three friends through their childhood, through their adolescence, and into adulthood. You follow their relationship with each other, and they are these minor players in this bigger, kind of shocking existence, and you're getting their small story, which within this larger thing. And it's so subtle, and it's so well done, and it's so beautiful, and it's heartbreaking, and it's gross, and it's just so good. And it is a book, and it is good, and you should read it. It is so good. I loved it so much. It's exactly what I like in this kind of fiction. And it's very much in Kazuo Ishiguro's style. I also read Clara and the Sun, and it's a similar take on this world where it's similar to our own, but there's really fucked up stuff that happens in it, and you're just getting this small glimpse through this small group of people that take part in this world. And it's just, man, I love this author. I really want to read more of his stuff. This book was wonderful. It was fantastic, and I loved it so much. Probably, definitely the best book I read this month, in my opinion. I loved it so much. It's a favorite of mine, and I think you should read it, but I don't think you should look too much into it. I don't know if I'm going to watch the movie. I don't know. We'll see. Okay, and by the time I finished all of those books, the only two spaces I had left on my bingo board that I hadn't filled out yet were the Fertilizer Space, which was a book that will nourish your soul, and the Sunspace, which is a happy book. And I don't read that many happy books or soul-nourishing books, I guess. So I just read another book that I wanted to read, and it was Lud-in-the-Mist by Hope Meirelles. And yeah, it counts for lots of stuff, lots of spaces that I had already done, so it doesn't even matter what it counts for. But this is a book that was written in the 1920s. It's a pre-Tolkien fantasy, so it was fantasy written before fantasy got changed by Tolkien. And it's about this town called Lud-in-the-Mist, which is in a fictional country called Dormer. Dormer lies on the border of fairyland, where the fairies live. And the book is all about the people in Lud-in-the-Mist trying to uphold this 100 centuries long tradition of not mentioning fairyland. But fairyland, something about it is trying to creep back into the culture of the human world, which they are very resistant to. And it's about a small group of people trying to save their children from fairies and fairy fruit and getting stolen away in the night by fairies. And it's a murder mystery, and it's, I don't know, it's all about the dynamics of people and them not wanting to be fairyfied. And I was fine. It's a classic and it's good, and I feel like, I don't know, it was fine. It was good. It was very similar to Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. Not like, it was similar in some ways. Like, there's the human world, and then there's the fairy world, and the human world hasn't had contact with the fairy world for a really long time, and blah, 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 blah. I don't know. It's an old-time fantasy, and it was good, but I didn't love it. It like wasn't necessarily my thing. Neil Gaiman actually gave really rave reviews for this book and Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. And this is the book that he calls this book like a super important book in the fantasy genre. And I can see that. I can see this being like an OG classic pulled from sort of novel. And I feel like it is probably very important in the fantasy canon, like this type of fantasy. It was also very influential to Neil Gaiman's book Stardust, which I really did enjoy. There are a lot of similarities between this and Stardust. But, you know, I don't know. I'm glad I read it, and it was fun, but it just kind of like wasn't exactly my thing. But if you're into kind of like old style, like Englishy, like fairies are the bad guys and you're following people trying to figure out how to stay away from fairies, kind of like fantasy. I don't know. It's good. Also, if you like murder mysteries, it was very like kind of almost procedural in that way, like trying to figure out like a long since forgotten murder. Like, yeah, I don't know. It was fun. It was fun. This is my stack of books. I'm also pretty proud that most of the books I read this month were actually physical books from my shelf. Only one audiobook, which was The Passenger. And yeah, it was a good month. So that's it for this video. Those are all the books that I read, and thank you so much for joining me and listening to me talk about books, because you know I like doing that. And again, I did this readathon, the Bloomin Readathon, which happens once a year in November, as a part of two other booktubers thing. Allie from Alice in Pages and Kirst from Kirst Reads, and I will link both of their YouTube channels in the description box below. They are two such good, wonderful, words aren't working, wonderful YouTube channels. I love them. So check them out if you haven't yet. And if you're interested in reading any of the books that I talked about, let me know what you're planning on or what you're just reading right now in general. It's December now, so are you reading cozy winter books? I would love to know. And again, if you're interested in supporting the channel and keeping videos coming out, please feel free to check out my Patreon in the description box below. And if you would like to subscribe to my channel and give it a thumbs up, I would appreciate that as well. Okay, I will see you in the next video, and I hope you're having a wonderful December. I'll see you all next time. Love you, and goodbye.